Hello, thoughtful Libra. Something you once carried almost effortlessly may be feeling heavier now, and the reason may have less to do with what is changing around you than with what you are finally beginning to notice within yourself. There is an old emotional pattern here, one that may have been gathering weight for something like 15 years, not as a sentence written by the stars, but as a symbolic measure of how long the same inner arrangement can survive before it begins asking to be changed. 15 years is long enough for a compromise to become routine, for routine to become a role, and for that role to begin answering to your name. You may already recognize the signs in surprisingly ordinary places. Rest does not reach the particular tiredness you have been carrying. A familiar relationship dynamic appears again through a different person. Or a situation at work leaves you with the strange feeling that you have stood on this exact emotional ground before. What if the calm you have worked so hard to preserve was not always the same thing as peace? What if some of that stillness was simply the quiet space between one adjustment and the next? That distinction matters for Libra, because balance is more complicated than looking composed from the outside. You can appear peaceful while something inside you remains constantly alert, reading the room, measuring reactions, deciding how much truth can be spoken without disturbing anyone else. One side of the scale grows heavier, then the other, and somehow you become the person standing between them, shifting your own weight again and again to keep everything level. Eventually, even graceful adjustments begin to leave marks. You were not necessarily born knowing how to do this. Sometimes the habit develops quietly, especially when you learn early that a peaceful room feels safer than a tense one, or that watching someone's expression before speaking can prevent an argument before it begins. Maybe you learn to hear the smallest change in another person's voice, to hold back a thought until the atmosphere softened, or to discover that asking for less made everything around you easier. None of those moments had to look dramatic for them to teach you something powerful about belonging. Over time, you may have absorbed a subtle lesson. Your place was at the center of the scales, managing the balance rather than adding your own honest weight to either side. And for a long time, that strategy may genuinely have worked, helping you navigate relationships, family dynamics, friendships, and difficult rooms with remarkable sensitivity. But a scale cannot create fairness simply because it looks level. It responds to whatever weight is placed upon it. If everyone else's needs keep finding a place while yours are repeatedly removed, what appears to be harmony can slowly become imbalance. Wearing beautiful clothes. This is where the idea of a 15-year karmic pattern becomes more useful as a metaphor than as a prediction. Think of a path walked for 15 years. After enough footsteps, the ground remembers the route, and eventually your feet begin following it before you consciously choose where to go. The faces may change, the circumstances may look completely different, yet the emotional position you occupy can remain strangely familiar. A relationship asks you to accommodate, a workplace quietly appoints you the mediator, or someone else's discomfort becomes a problem you instinctively feel responsible for solving. Have you ever caught yourself thinking, I know this feeling, I've been here before, even when the circumstances are new? That recognition does not have to mean fate is repeating itself, or that some invisible force has decided your future. It may simply mean an old adaptation has traveled with you from one chapter of life into another, changing its clothes while keeping the same underlying shape. 15 years, in that sense, is long enough for surrender, adjustment, and silence to become so familiar that you stop noticing where the pattern ends and your personality begins. And when something this old begins to loosen, the first sign may be surprisingly undramatic. There may be no spectacular rupture, no single conversation that explains everything, no obvious moment when one version of your life closes and another begins. Instead, what once seemed easy to absorb may suddenly feel strangely heavy. The message you used to answer immediately sits unanswered for a while. The casual last-minute request tightens something in your body, and whatever works for everyone no longer comes out quite as effortlessly as it once did. You might even wonder why you are more tired when nothing obvious appears to have changed. You can sleep, take time away, care for yourself, and still sense a deeper weariness moving underneath ordinary fatigue, because physical rest cannot always replenish energy spent on constant emotional adjustment. Somewhere along the way, Libra, your instinct for diplomacy may have become faster than conscious choice. Before you know what you want, you are already softening the sentence, finding the compromise, making room at the table, and checking whether everyone else has a chair. There is real strength in being able to read a room with that much sensitivity, but strength can become costly when it is never allowed to rest. The person who repeatedly manages the emotional weather may eventually forget what it feels like to simply stand in the rain without trying to move the clouds for everyone else. This is where harmony can quietly cross into self-erasure, not because kindness was ever the problem, but because kindness offered automatically leaves very little room to ask whether you actually wanted to offer it. And that question may be becoming harder to avoid now. Perhaps the shift begins in a moment so small that nobody else notices it. Someone asks something of you, and the familiar yes rises almost automatically, ready to keep the room comfortable exactly as it has so many times before. But this time, there is a pause between the request and your answer. Inside that pause comes a question that may carry far more weight than its few words suggest. Do I actually want this? That pause does not mean you are becoming less generous, less loving, or less capable of creating harmony. It may mean the old pathway is no longer the only path your feet know how to follow, and the tide inside you is beginning to move in another direction. After years of swinging between what you genuinely feel and what you believe other people need from you, the movement may be slowing enough for you to notice the center beneath it. And when you begin to wonder what remains when you are no longer defined by constant adjustment, another question quietly rises with it. Would there really be less of you there? Or would you finally have enough room to discover how much of you has been waiting to take its rightful place on the scale? There is a difference, Libra, between creating harmony around you and having a life that feels structurally sound within you. You can become remarkably skilled at smoothing conversations, anticipating tension, and making sure everyone has room to breathe, while somewhere beneath all of that grace, your own inner foundation is quietly carrying too much. What may be shifting now is not something you need to bring in from outside yourself. It is closer to walking into a familiar room and finally noticing how strangely the furniture has been arranged. Nothing essential is missing. You may simply be ready to move things around so your own needs are no longer pushed against the wall. If something in that recognition feels both comforting and uncomfortable, pay attention to the mixture rather than rushing to name it. Sometimes relief arrives beside grief because finally understanding a pattern also means seeing how long you have been living inside it. You may have sensed pieces of this before, perhaps in those moments when another compromise left you unexpectedly tired, or when saying, "It's fine," did not feel fine once you were alone. The difference now may be that these scattered moments are beginning to form a picture you can actually see, and before the ordinary noise of life covers that picture again, ask yourself something simple. Where have you been wavering for so long that you can no longer tell whether the behavior reflects who you are or merely what you learned to do? Tell me in the comments where that pattern shows up most clearly for you, whether it is love, family, friendship, work, or somewhere more difficult to name. You do not need a polished explanation. Sometimes identifying the room where the imbalance lives is enough to begin seeing what has been happening there. Because this is where the idea of karma becomes much more useful when it is separated from punishment. No invisible judge is keeping a record of every time you swallowed an opinion, changed your plans, or made yourself easier to accommodate. There is no celestial ledger waiting to collect a debt because you gave too much of yourself away. What exists is quieter and more human. Repeated choices leave tracks, and when you walk the same path long enough, your feet can begin following it before you have consciously decided where you want to go. That is how an old adaptation can start to resemble destiny, when it may actually be a pattern that has simply gone unquestioned for years. Imagine instead a table where you have spent years making room for everyone who arrives. You pull out another chair, move your plate aside, make sure one person gets what they prefer, then shift again when somebody else needs more space. Nothing about any single gesture looks alarming. In fact, most of it looks generous. But one day you glance around and realize everyone has somewhere to sit except you. Think about how quietly this can happen in real life. At a family gathering, perhaps you agree to the restaurant everyone else wants, even though nobody asked what you were craving. Or among friends, you accept the inconvenient time because changing it might disappoint someone. Maybe you let another person have the last word because preserving the mood seems easier than explaining why something bothered you. Each choice is tiny enough to disappear almost as soon as it happens, which is precisely why years of them can accumulate without looking like a problem. Generosity remains generosity when you are free to choose it. But when accommodation becomes the role everyone expects you to perform, and the role you expect from yourself, it begins to carry a different emotional weight. You are no longer occasionally making room for someone you love. You may be unconsciously measuring your worth by how little disruption your own needs create. A pattern does not need dramatic events to become powerful, Libra. Sometimes it is built from hundreds of harmless-looking moments that all lean in the same direction. That is also why the exhaustion can be so difficult to explain. Nothing seems large enough to justify how tired you feel, so you may turn the question against yourself and wonder why you cannot simply handle things better. Yet a tree growing for years against a persistent wind does not reveal the history of that pressure in one dramatic scar. You see it in the direction of the branches, in the way the trunk learned to compensate, in the shape created by years of responding. Your emotional habits can carry history in much the same way. Seeing this changes the meaning of the pattern because it moves the source of change away from some external force and places it closer to your own hands. If karma here is understood as consequence rather than punishment, then you are not waiting for the universe to decide that you have suffered enough. You are noticing where an old arrangement continues because you keep participating in it, often before conscious choice even enters the room. That realization can sting, but it also means the pattern is not entirely beyond your reach. This does not mean blaming yourself for learning how to survive difficult emotional environments. If you discovered early that acceptance felt more secure when everyone around you was comfortable, then becoming perceptive, accommodating, and careful may once have served an important purpose. The difficulty comes when an old form of protection continues operating long after you have entered rooms where you are allowed to have preferences, limits, disagreements, and needs. A skill that once helped you navigate tension can become exhausting when it never receives permission to switch off. And still, you may compare yourself with people who seem able to carry more without becoming depleted. You may think, why does this affect me so much? Other people manage. But comparison ignores the invisible work happening underneath the visible task, because you may not only be answering the message, completing the project, or having the conversation, you may also be calculating tone, anticipating disappointment, preparing explanations, and quietly managing the emotional temperature around every decision. The burden is not always the thing you are doing. Sometimes it is everything you believe you must prevent while doing it. This is why the same pattern can travel so easily from one relationship into another. The partner may change, the circumstances may look new, and yet you somehow find yourself occupying a familiar chair. The person who understands first waits longer, adjusts more, and gives the other person another chance before asking what the waiting is costing you. It can feel like meeting different people inside the same emotional architecture. After enough repetitions, you may begin wondering whether the common thread was ever the people themselves or the position you automatically took beside them. Work can reveal the same arrangement in a different language. You become the person who can calm tension in a meeting, rescue the project nobody wants, cover the unfinished task, or say yes because refusing would create a few uncomfortable seconds. You would rather absorb yourself. Other people may even praise you for being dependable, composed, and easy to work with, never realizing how much private negotiation happens before each agreement. The environment changes, but the underlying movement remains familiar. Discomfort appears, and you instinctively step toward it, so somebody else does not have to. This is where the old pattern begins to become visible in a new way. Perhaps the real question is no longer why the same kinds of situations keep finding you, but why you keep finding yourself in the same position once they arrive. And if you have been holding yourself to an emotional obligation that nobody consciously asked you to carry, there may be something important in recognizing that you are also allowed to reconsider its terms. The shift does not require you to become less compassionate. It asks whether compassion can finally include the person who has been providing it. That may be the hardest part to absorb, Libra. For so long, placing weight on your own side of the scale may have felt dangerously close to selfishness, while leaving that side empty looked like generosity. But no structure remains balanced because one side continually removes itself so the other can stay full. At some point, what appears beautifully harmonious from across the room may reveal itself up close as an arrangement sustained by your absence. And once you begin noticing that difference, even the smallest choices start to carry a different kind of weight. Think of a tree that has spent years growing beneath a wind that almost always comes from the same direction. At first, the branches bend and recover so naturally that nobody thinks about what all that weather is shaping. Eventually, even a mild gust can make the tree tremble more than expected. What looks like sudden sensitivity may actually be the accumulated memory of pressure leaning against the same branches for years. You may already be noticing something similar in yourself, Libra. A careless remark you once brushed aside lingers under your skin. A last-minute request creates unexpected irritation, or a responsibility that was never yours suddenly feels impossible to absorb gracefully. You might wonder why things you once handled easily now bother you so much. But perhaps your patience is not weakening. Perhaps something within you has stopped pretending that endless flexibility costs nothing. That distinction matters, because irritation is not always evidence that something is wrong. Sometimes it is information arriving after years of being softened or ignored, a signal from the part of you that has spent too long adapting without being consulted. If 15 years speaks to you, let it represent that accumulation rather than a cosmic deadline. Enough seasons for a coping strategy to become familiar. Enough repetition for accommodation to resemble personality. Eventually, what has been quietly carried becomes difficult to keep invisible. And here is the paradox. The more energy you spend keeping everyone else steady, the easier it became to drift away from your own center without realizing it. You may have believed you were keeping the emotional room level through patience, diplomacy, and understanding. Yet every time you removed some of your own weight to make balance easier for someone else, you became slightly less present inside the harmony you were creating. This imbalance rarely announces itself loudly. There may be no crisis revealing how much effort exists beneath your calm exterior. People may simply know you as thoughtful, reasonable, easy to talk to the person, unlikely to make a difficult moment harder. What they cannot see is everything happening inside you before that calm response reaches your lips. They do not hear the internal editing before you soften a sentence, or feel the opinion you almost voiced before deciding it was easier to let the moment pass. They do not feel that small contraction when you say, "Okay, we can do it your way," while another preference quietly retreats. None of these moments seem significant alone. Together they begin revealing a life increasingly organized around preventing friction. That is why recognition can feel strangely heavy. Once you see the pattern clearly, familiar acts of accommodation no longer feel entirely neutral. You begin noticing which compromises leave you genuinely peaceful and which leave something unresolved behind. Little by little, the difference between generosity and disappearance becomes harder to ignore. So what happens when you begin placing your own weight back on the scale? From the outside, perhaps very little changes at first. You still show up, listen carefully, and care about fairness, but something inside begins to reorganize. Opinions you once swallowed remain present longer, while desires you postponed begin asking to be treated as information rather than inconvenience. Relationships may respond differently. Some people may adjust and discover that greater honesty gives the connection more room to breathe, while others may resist because they were accustomed to how much discomfort you absorbed. A few bonds may reveal how heavily they depended on your accommodation. These reactions do not automatically determine whether someone should stay or go. They simply reveal what happens when one person stops maintaining the entire balance alone. Beneath this sits a tender fear. If you stop bending so easily, will people still want to be close to you? That fear makes sense if keeping the atmosphere peaceful once helped you feel safer, accepted, or easier to love. When belonging becomes connected with being agreeable, even a healthy boundary can feel dangerous. Your mind may know that saying no is reasonable, while your body reacts as though something precious is at risk. But affection that only feels comfortable while you remain partially hidden is different from affection spacious enough for your full presence. Some relationships may need time to learn a new rhythm with you, bringing temporary awkwardness or friction. Others may become warmer because there is less guessing and quiet resentment beneath the surface. What matters is that another person's reaction no longer automatically determines whether your needs were legitimate. None of this requires you to become the opposite of who you have been. You do not have to trade diplomacy for harshness, generosity for selfishness, or sensitivity for indifference. Your instinct for harmony can remain a beautiful part of how you move through relationships. What changes is whether harmony still requires you to leave yourself outside the room. The shift may begin with something almost too small to notice. Someone asks for your time, agreement, or flexibility, and the familiar answer begins rising before you have checked how you feel. Instead of immediately saying yes, you leave a little space. In that silence, you ask whether the concession comes from genuine care or an old fear of disappointing someone. That pause is where the old pattern begins losing authority. It does not force you to say no. Sometimes you will listen inwardly and still choose yes because giving genuinely feels right. The difference is that the answer belongs to you again. What used to be reflex slowly becomes choice. At first, this will not always feel graceful. Sometimes you will notice the pattern only after you have already agreed, while saying no on another day may leave you carrying more guilt than relief. You may replay conversations and wonder whether you were too firm simply because you did not immediately make everything easier for someone else. New balance can feel unstable when your body has spent years becoming skilled at the old one. That discomfort does not automatically mean you chose incorrectly. Sometimes it means you stepped off a familiar path and your feet have not yet learned the new ground. You do not need to perform this transformation perfectly or treat one reflexive yes as though it erases your progress. What matters is continuing to notice when your own voice disappears and what happened just before it did. With repetition, that pause can become part of your natural rhythm. You may discover that balance never meant keeping everyone peaceful while removing your own weight from the equation. It can mean allowing care for others and care for yourself to exist together, even when that creates negotiation or honest discomfort. And as your side of the scale becomes visible again, you may begin noticing how differently life responds when harmony no longer has to be purchased with your silence. What you may have been calling 15 years of karma, Libra, does not need to be understood as a sentence you were forced to serve. Think of those years instead as emotional history, enough time for one way of protecting peace to become so familiar that you stop recognizing it as a strategy. Beneath the compromises, careful wording, and instinct to make things easier for everyone else, another message may have been waiting for you to hear it. Balance was never supposed to require your disappearance. Real balance is not the absence of weight. It is the willingness to distribute that weight honestly. Your needs do not become unfair because someone else has needs too, and your preferences do not threaten harmony simply because they change a conversation. The scales were never asking you to make yourself lighter until everyone else felt comfortable. They were asking for every meaningful part of the situation, including you, to have a place. There is a difference between stillness created by suppression and stillness created by inner steadiness. One is the quiet of holding your breath so nothing moves. The other is standing on ground strong enough to support movement without losing its shape. You can still notice shifts in the emotional atmosphere, Libra, without responding to every movement by immediately moving yourself. Sensitivity does not have to disappear for boundaries to emerge. That may be the deeper balance you are beginning to learn. You can hear disappointment without treating it as something you must repair. Notice tension without rushing to dissolve it, and love someone without making their comfort the measure of whether the relationship is healthy. Your instinct for fairness remains, but now fairness begins turning inward as well as outward. You begin creating peace from a center that finally includes you. This is where the symbolism of 15 years becomes meaningful without becoming a prediction. 15 years is long enough for accommodation to become routine, routine to become a role, and that role to begin answering to your name. Walk the same path for enough seasons and the earth forms a trail beneath your feet until you forget other directions exist. What may be changing is not fate, but your willingness to notice that path before automatically following it again. Perhaps an earlier version of you learned that peaceful belonging meant taking up less emotional space. Being agreeable may have kept certain rooms calmer or made disagreement feel less dangerous. That version of you does not need to be judged. It adapted to the weather it knew, bending toward the wind, because bending once felt safer. But adaptation is not identity, Libra, and what once protected connection does not have to govern every relationship you enter now. A branch shaped by years of wind can still reach toward a different opening when conditions change. You could appreciate what an old strategy protected without carrying it unchanged into every room ahead, especially when preserving peace begins asking you to pay with pieces of yourself. That recognition alone begins changing the meaning of harmony. And this transition may be much quieter than you imagined. There may never be a morning when you wake up and announce that 15 years of karma have officially passed, because emotional patterns rarely obey calendars that precisely. Instead, the evidence appears in ordinary moments that nobody else would call milestones. You recognize their importance because you know how differently you once would have responded. One day you disagree with someone without spending the next hour composing apologies in your head. Another day you leave a message unanswered until you genuinely have the energy to respond, rather than treating immediate availability as proof that you care. You rest without searching for someone else's problem to solve, or choose what you actually want, without first surveying everyone else's preferences. These moments look ordinary, and that is exactly what makes them meaningful. The shift may also appear in the small pause before an automatic yes. A request arrives, and you feel the familiar urge to agree before inconvenience can enter the room. But instead of immediately stepping onto that old path, you remain still long enough to ask what you actually think. Sometimes the answer will still be yes, only now it comes from generosity rather than fear. Other times the answer may be no, not today, or I need to think about it. Guilt may still follow because a reflex practiced for years does not disappear simply because you understand it. But guilt is not always evidence that you have done something wrong. Sometimes it is simply the sensation of behaving differently from what an old pattern expected. With time, you can learn to observe that feeling without immediately running back to correct yourself. Your changing balance does not need to look impressive from the outside. There may be no dramatic rupture or declaration that makes everyone understand what has shifted. The deeper change is that your inner life is no longer organized entirely around preventing other people from becoming uncomfortable. You begin allowing relationships to contain difference, negotiation, disappointment, repair, and honest preference. Some people may barely notice, while others may feel the difference because they were accustomed to how quickly you adjusted. What matters is whether your relationships can make room for a version of you who is present rather than merely accommodating. Real balance does not require one person to remain permanently lighter. It learns to hold the weight of two complete people. Perhaps that is the quiet renewal hidden inside this 15-year image. You are not destroying the Libra who cares deeply about harmony, and you do not need to become harder to prove you have grown. You are allowing that gift to mature, so peace is no longer measured by how successfully you erase friction. Harmony becomes spacious enough for disagreement, boundaries, and your own voice. There is a stillness that comes from giving up your place, and another that comes from finally inhabiting it. They can look almost identical from across the room, but inside they feel completely different. One asks you to remain small so nothing is disturbed. The other lets you breathe fully while life continues moving. And you may be beginning to recognize that second kind of quiet now. So the 15-year pattern needs no ceremonial closing date or invisible clock demanding transformation on schedule. Its meaning can be more human, noticing what is repeated, understanding why it once made sense, and discovering choice where there used to be reflex. The old path may remain visible when you are tired, afraid, or surrounded by familiar dynamics. But seeing the path means you are no longer walking it entirely in your sleep. Perhaps the peace you were searching for was never the perfect silence that comes when everyone else is satisfied. Perhaps it is knowing that when you arrange the room, you remember to leave a chair for yourself. When you weigh what matters, your truth remains on the scale. That balance cannot be measured by a calendar or certified by the stars. It begins in ordinary moments when you remain present inside your own life, discovering what changes when you no longer have to disappear for everything else to stay standing.